This is Cape Chronicle. I'm Jacob McClellan. Morley Swingle left his post as Cape Girardeau County's prosecuting attorney in November to join the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cape Girardeau. Swingle served as the county's prosecutor since 1987 when he replaced Larry Farrell. Now, Swingle is again working with Farrell as a federal prosecutor. Morley Swingle, thank you so much for coming by to talk with us.
Thank you, Jacob. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about some of the cases that you tried over the years with the Cape Girardeau County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, because you were an assistant before you were the you were the county prosecutor, dating back to, I believe, 1982.
That's right.
So that's a lot of cases that you tried over 3 decades in that office. Let's talk a little bit about Michael Davis and the hazing case back in the 90s, because this was something that really gathered national attention.
Yes, even before the internet, this was a case that was talked about by Dan Rather on the nightly news and ended up being on Dateline and Oprah even. It established the constitutionality of Missouri's hazing statute when we prosecuted a dozen people for hazing of Michael Davis, and 7 of them were charged with involuntary manslaughter for recklessly causing his death, and 2 of them ended up going to jury trial, and so it was a huge time-consuming deal, but it was really important, and it was a case that I still think about a lot today.
Could you kind of run us through what happened here, the trial itself, and just kind of how it ended up getting to trial?
Well, the tragic thing about that case was Michael Davis was going into his senior year at SEMO, and he thought it would look good on his resume if he had been a member of a fraternity. So he was pledging his senior year, and at that time they had this hazing process, and they all went to the grassy area near the Abe Stuber track, and the frat guys got in a circle, and Michael Davis had to run from station to station where he'd either be punched or hit or kicked or thrown to the ground or drink beer. And he passed out, and they thought he'd passed out from too much alcohol, so they drove him home and put him in bed. It turned out he'd had a blood vessel in his brain rupture, and during the night it caused the pressure on the brain that caused his death of a subdural hematoma. So it was impossible to tell for sure which blow had killed him, so I charged all 7 people who had been at a station doing any kind of blow with acting in concert to cause his death. And so it ended up being two jury trials. Each of them was over a week long, and both of them occurred in the city of St. Louis. And it was a long, drawn-out process, but everybody ended up being convicted of what we charged them with. And I really think a strong message went out that if you kill somebody in a hazing incident, even if it's accidental, there's going to be consequences.
And this really raised the profile of hazing to a whole new level at this time, and that came from here in Cape Girardeau.
Right, and part of the reason you prosecute somebody is to try to deter other people from doing the same thing. And you know, there's still hazing that goes on here and there. You'll still read about it in the news somewhere, but I really think we had an impact in helping cut down hazing nationwide.
Let's talk a little bit about Timothy Kreitzer. He was the serial killer that really terrorized Cape Girardeau and the surrounding area back in the late 70s. But then just a few years ago, these cold cases, police in Carbondale figured out that this guy that had been in jail was Timothy Kreitzer, who was the guy. Tell us a little bit about this case.
Well, the highlight of my career as a prosecutor would have to be the 79 homicide cases I prosecuted, and one of the more interesting ones was one that didn't actually go to trial. It was the Kreitzer case, because ultimately he pled guilty. But the Cape Girardeau Police Department has a detective who works the cold cases, and Detective Jimmy Smith was the one that worked this case, and he had seen on the news that Kreitzer had been charged with a murder over in Illinois from around the same time frame. So he thought, I wonder. So he looked to see if there was still some DNA from those old cases, and he found out that there was a bit of DNA in Mildred Wallace's case. And so sure enough, the DNA came back positive, matching Kreitzer. And then it came to the point where that was the only case we could make based on the DNA, but we thought he might have done all 5 of them. And so the detective said to me, I'd sure like to see if he confessed all 5, would you waive the death penalty? And I said, well, no, because he's worse as a serial killer than other people I've gotten the death penalty for. I'm not going to waive it. And he kept saying, but the family would like to have closure in all these other cases. So finally, on a Thanksgiving weekend, we had all the surviving family members of all 5 victims come in, and my position was, unless all of them agree this is what they want me to do, I'm not going to waive the death penalty. But all of the victims' family members unanimously said, we would rather find out the truth about what happened to our loved one than have you get the death penalty on him. And so with that plea offer on the table, he ended up confessing and giving details that only the killer would have known as to these different crimes. And so that was a wonderful moment when these 5 cases that had been unsolved for 20 to 30 years all got solved in one pop. And it was frightening to realize we'd had a serial killer right here in Cape Girardeau in the late 70s and early 80s, and we hadn't even known it.
From a prosecutor's standpoint, how important is that to have the death penalty as almost not necessarily a bargaining chip, but as something that's on the table?
A lot of people don't realize that's an important reason to have the death penalty, because if you don't have it as a bargaining chip, a fellow who's killed multiple people has no incentive whatsoever to tell you the truth about what really happened, or to plead guilty. Also, it's particularly important in kidnapping cases, where if somebody kidnaps a bank president in the course of bank robbery, if he's going to get life in prison for the bank robbery, whether or not he kills the bank president, there's no reason not to just go ahead and kill that only witness against him. So I'm a firm believer in the death penalty, because it can save lives. And we had a case here in Cape Girardeau County where a man named Farrow had kidnapped a little girl, about 4 years old, sodomized her, and did sexual acts with her, but he knew there was a death penalty in Cape Girardeau, and so he took her out in the country and let her go, and she lived. And so my thought is, that's one person I know for sure whose life was saved by the death penalty being there. And so if it saves one innocent life of a little girl, it's worth having.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Gary Lee Roll. He had murdered 3 people back in 1992, and he was executed for this crime. Tell us a little bit about that crime and kind of the trial that came out of that.
The Roll case had happened in August. A 17-year-old drug dealer and his mother and his mentally handicapped brother, who was in his 20s, were all found dead one morning. They'd all been executed in their home, and it remained unsolved for a couple of months. And it turned out some good detective work solved it, and Gary Roll had done it. And he was a former Army man in the military, and he had decided to rob a drug dealer. It sounded like a crime that couldn't backfire, because you'd steal the money and the drugs from the drug dealer, and who's he going to go complain to? The police? Well, it turned out the 17-year-old drug dealer recognized him, and when Roll realized that, he ended up killing all 3 of the family members. And the importance of that case was that we hadn't had a death penalty case in Cape Girardeau County where somebody actually got the death penalty and was executed in 20 to 30 years. It had been like 1963. Sammy Tucker was the last guy to get the death penalty. And so that case was important because Gary Roll got the death penalty from a jury, and then he was executed. And I feel like that sent a strong message to the criminals in southeast Missouri that Missouri does have a death penalty, and it'll be enforced in Cape Girardeau County.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your books, in particular Scoundrels to the Hoosegow. This comes from your humor file at the prosecuting attorney's office, and now, as I understand it, it is in what, 1/3 of the law school libraries in the country, or something like that.
It started as what I called my humor file, where every time something funny would happen in one of my cases, I'd make a little note about it and stick it in a file. And one day I realized I had a bunch of those stories, and so I started giving service clubs. If you'd go talk to Lions Club or Rotary, I'd say, would you rather hear my thoughts on the death penalty, or would you rather hear the most entertaining things that have happened to me as prosecutor? And they always chose the funny stories. So eventually I thought I could turn that into a book, and I gave each one a Perry Mason type title for each chapter, and then I called the book Scoundrels to the Hoosegow, and I thought it was a type of title that Mark Twain would have liked. And so the nice thing for me is that book is now in 1/3 of the nation's law schools, including Harvard and Yale, a couple of law schools that wouldn't take me as a student. So I got in their school anyway, even if it's just in their law library.
Real quickly, you've written a couple of other books, and are there any other books on the in the future right now for you?
Well, I've written the historical novels, The Gold of Cape Girardeau and Boot Hill Man. They're both set in Cape, and I'm working on a novel now where the elected prosecutor is murdered in the first chapter. So that's been a lot of fun. There's a lot of suspects, and it's been a lot of fun to work on.
We've been talking today with Morley Swingle. He's a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Cape Girardeau. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Coming up, how to have fun in Cape Girardeau during the winter. And that's just ahead on Cape Chronicle.
Welcome home, man.
To be a good father is the most important job in a man's life, but it doesn't have to be hard. Play catch, go to a park or visit a zoo. Help your child with their homework. Sit down together for dinner. Ask them how their day was. Things get busy, and sometimes we all fall short. But the smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.